Welcome to the virtual April edition of the Northeast Ohio Development Exchange. We love acronyms, so in short, we say NODE. Eadon, Director of Partnerships and Engagement with Team NEO, a Jobs Ohio network partner, where our mission is to create jobs by driving capital investments into the region through our business retention and expansion efforts, and in so doing, we work to attract the talent to our great region. Today's a great day. Why? Because we're going to talk about money, but it's through the American Rescue Plan Act, also known with another acronym, ARP. As many of you know, this was passed by Congress and signed by President Biden, providing the $1.9 trillion in relief to help the nation recover from the pandemic. But we have an esteemed group of individuals that will discuss how ARP can support your business development efforts, as well as gain insights in how you can perceive the use of these available dollars. Please welcome our panelists today: Jeff Harris, as noted, public finance attorney of Eckler, LLP; Jennifer Price, executive director of the Ohio Economic Development Association; and then our Northeast Ohio economic development leaders: Bethany Dentler, our very own executive director of the Medina County Economic Development Corporation; and certainly last but not least, Harry Eadon, president, Tuscarawas County Economic Development Corporation. At this time, I will turn the virtual lectern over to our esteemed guests. Please utilize the question and answer chat box, and they will work the questions and answer throughout the presentation today. Enjoy.
All right, I guess I get to lead off. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jennifer Price, Executive Director of OEDA. Ohio Economic Development Association is quite a mouthful, so most often you have probably heard us referred to as OEDA. So I just want to start off a little bit. For those of you who are not members of OEDA or possibly not familiar with us, we are Ohio's professional association for economic developers and those working in allied professions and working to advance their local economies. The bulk of our members are economic developers, though we do have working in all different types of capacities, whether or not they are working for local government, like a city or county, at the state level, DSA, Jobs Ohio, ODOT, regional level, all the REDOs, all the private economic development organizations, airport, other port authorities, you name it. Our membership is very diverse and very broad. Knowing that, we have over 500 members in OEDA, and we really focus on three things: expanding your knowledge, expanding your network, and expanding your influence. So today I'm going to drill down on the second one, and if you don't mind advancing to the next one, which is expanding your influence. Since we are here talking about ARP today, I think it's appropriate to talk a little bit more about OEDA's advocacy program. Again, for those of you who are not familiar with it, OEDA has a long tradition of working to educate legislators and policymakers on economic development issues. And as OEDA has grown and matured, our advocacy program has as well. And so I want to talk a little bit about how it is structured and a little bit about what we do. Because we do get a lot of questions about, well, how do you decide what you're going to do on a piece of legislation? Our advocacy program is very, very important to OEDA. And one of the reasons, and those of you who know me know I'm very personally passionate about advocacy, policy, and legislation, because it's one of the most effective ways you can have an impact, and also an opportunity to not necessarily be reactive, but be proactive in working for the things that are important to you. So we do have a policy and legislation committee that really is the, I would say, the foundation of our advocacy program. Our policy and legislation committee is has representatives from all around the state of Ohio. We have, we make sure that we have 2 people from each of the 6 Jobs Ohio network partner regions. We have specific subject matter experts We have ex officio members who are our partners, and that would include Bricker and Eckler. OEDA has worked with Bricker and Eckler for many, many years. They are our legislative counsel, and so we engage them for legislative services. Going back to kind of how we decide what we're going to work on, the Policy and Legislation Committee, again, a lot of the work is done in that committee in developing our policy platform, better known as the Agenda for Ohio. And there's more information about this on our website. So I won't go too far into the weeds, but it does cover everything from the importance of sites and site inventory and site development, which would cover brownfield, greenfield. We cover infrastructure and energy. We look at transportation as a big piece of it. So, I mean, we talk about economic development programs, specifically looking at economic development programs at the state level that our members utilize on a daily basis. So that's everything from CREs and enterprise zones to the importance of funding Ohio's transportation budget, and even looking at greenfield, looking at making sure that local economic developers have a voice. And so that's really what our advocacy efforts are about, is making sure that the voice of the economic development community is represented and carried to the State House. So again, you can find more about our agenda for Ohio on our website if you go under the policy tab. But again, it's really about informing, educating, and advocating. A lot of terms are always thrown around and used. You hear advocacy, you hear lobbying, you hear legislative program, you hear government relations. And ultimately what it is really based on advancing your interest in favor or in opposition to a specific policy or bill. And so in Ohio, we have a legislature that likes to sponsor and develop many pieces of legislation. We're one of the more active state legislators in the country. In fact, it's even interesting in states like Texas, which has been in the news a lot with its energy issues recently. Their legislature only meets for a couple of months each year. So our legislature is year-round. So again, very important to OEDA and our members. And that is one of the reasons that we work with Bricker and Eckler as well. OEDA, again, we really want to make sure that legislators and policymakers are making informed decisions, not only in their role representing the entire state of Ohio, but also very specifically understanding how it might impact their district. Depending on the characteristics of their specific district, economic development opportunities and challenges. So again, informing and educating is something we focus heavily on, but advocating again is when you're actually, I think if you can see that little icon, it says the act of pleading or arguing, but again, advocacy is when you go and you take a specific position or interest on a policy, a rule, or a piece of legislation. So the advocacy part is kind of the third pillar of our platform. Or I should say our program. And again, this is where when there's consensus among our membership, the Policy and Legislation Committee reviews various pieces of legislation of interest to economic developers and with the potential to have a huge impact on economic development efforts in Ohio. And the Policy and Legislation Committee, working with Bricker and our ex officios and our members of our policy committee, review it and decide if the committee would be recommending OEDA takes a position on the piece of legislation. So for those of you somewhat less familiar, you can communicate with legislators I guess from 3 viewpoints. You can first do it as an interested party, where you're doing less advocacy, less of a hard specific position or a position on a bill as a whole. And so when you testify as an interested party, you're just kind of helping them, you're providing your expertise to help them understand what this bill might do or how something works and how something is impacted by a proposed piece of legislation. So an interested party is one of the options. We can support a bill, we can be a proponent of a bill, or we can be an opponent of a bill and be working to see that bill die a swift death. So, but a lot of it does focus on interested party. In fact, just recently, OEDA made the news in the State House reports, some testimony that we provided on the broadband bill, the broadband expansion bill, as well as the CRA program revision bill. So our testimony was heavily picked up in the State House media, again, where we were trying to help educators or help educate policymakers about what these programs do and how the program might be impacted in terms of various provisions in a piece of legislation. So, but we do, when there's consensus. Ohio's a very diverse state. Our membership is not so homogenous that we can automatically take a position of support or opposition on a piece of legislation. So through the Policy and Legislation Committee, we're able to help determine what our position will be. And very often it is as an interested party, because they're, as we know, again, in Ohio, very diverse. What is important to one community may not be as important to another. The ways in which tools are used, how frequently, how important they are, that varies. So there's not always a consensus opinion completely on a piece of legislation. So we will often, again, work as an interested party, focusing on informing and educating legislators and helping them understand the technical components. And very important here is working to encourage legislators and connect them with their local economic development professionals. This is a great way for them to better understand what this means to their community. That's very important because, again, very diverse state, not one size fits all. That's very important. Part of our entire platform is making sure that there's local flexibility and local control, and the voice of the local economic development professional is heard. So again, we work to connect legislators with economic developers in their district to help them understand the impact of something. So a little bit about, again, how it works. The Policy and Legislation Committee reviews and vets legislation and makes a recommendation to the OEDA Board of Directors. So I love our Policy and Legislation Committee, and I absolutely love our chair of our Policy and Legislation Committee, which is Harry Eadon. I'm not just saying that because he is with us today, but it is one of the most active programs that OEDA has, and definitely one of the most active committees. So the amount of effort and time that the committee members put in and that Harry invests in the program has made a huge difference in helping to really, again, elevate your influence at the State House. So again, we have two focuses. We have our state level advocacy, and then we have our federal level advocacy. So at the State House, we really work very closely with Brooker to make sure that there is a presence for economic developers literally on a daily basis at the State House. So the Brooker and Eckler team is our boots on the ground. In addition, I'm also a registered lobbyist with JLEC to make sure that we're all hands on deck as necessary when it comes to legislative matters, which move very, very quickly. Then we meet with legislators, we offer testimony, and then we also do media advocacy, as I mentioned, about being in the news and being in the State House media. Then last one will be in Congress. I know I've really gone into the weeds. Again, everyone knows I get really excited about this stuff. So we work with Ohio's congressional delegation. We work very closely in partnership with IEDC. And again, a big focus, there's always various pieces of legislation that come up, but we are always working to make sure that EDA programs are funded. So I probably went a little bit too far into the weeds. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the program. I encourage everyone to familiarize themselves with our platform. Let us know if you have interest in being part of the Policy and Legislation Committee. If you're a member, check out our legislative newsletter, which is done monthly. That's on our website. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. So what I will do is go through a quick review of the American Rescue Plan Act, as quick as can be, right, on a 243-page piece of legislation. It's got a ton of money in it. But we'll cover a lot of the highlights, and then I know we've got a nice panel with Harry and Bethany and Jennifer and myself to talk through aspects of this program or this legislation. So what I thought I'd do is go through this quickly. If we want to take questions through chat function, then we just address them one by one at the end, if that's okay. That way I can just cover the material, and then we can always go back through the presentation to cover items that maybe need clarification. As Jennifer noted, I am Jeff Harris with Bricker and Eckler. Pleasure to be with you all today. For those of you who dialed in early enough to hear the song, thank you for the compliment on the music choice. Renee and I went through that together. I will tell you a fun fact that the OJs who sang For the Love of Money are from Cleveland, although they recorded that song in Philadelphia. Gerald Levert and his, I think, cousins or friends with the OJs are Cleveland's own. So happy to have shared that with you today. That's the most important part of my presentation. Now we'll actually get into the American Rescue Plan Act. What we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through the three pieces of federal stimulus because I think it's important to see how we got there today. I'm going to cover elements of the Rescue Plan Act individually. Ohio's rollout, we don't know yet. In fact, there's going to be a lot of question marks today, but there are some things that we do know. So as we get to the end of this presentation, hit us with a lot of questions because I will tell you, our firm, probably among many, many law firms in Ohio, we're getting a lot of questions on how the Rescue Plan Act functions. So let's deal with those questions if they come up with you all today. Let's follow the breadcrumbs. So first and foremost, you've got three pieces of federal stimulus that all started with CARES Act last March. And that CARES Act famously pushed out the first of the individual payments to Americans. It also pushed out, at the time, pretty large amount of federal stimulus to state and local governments, in this case, $150 billion for eligible costs by local governments and the state at the time through December 30th of last year. Those funds were distributed to 6 cities and counties in Ohio directly, and the rest of the local governments in Ohio received their funding through the state and Ohio OBM, and by the Ohio General Assembly making actual specific appropriations through a couple different mechanisms: House Bill 481, House Bill 614, and then state controlling board actions back in June pushed the 3.75, or actually really 1.2 billion out to local governments in Ohio. And for those of you on this call, that may have been the first tranche of, oh my God, what do I do with all this money type of event for you, which may also have led you to ask your law director or your village solicitor, can I do this? Which we fielded a lot of questions about that too. There's a lot of interpretation in the CARES Act. Then at the end of December, after some hemming and hawing with some threats and some kind of givesies backsies, the former president signed the second piece of stimulus, and that is what is known as the Consolidated Appropriations Act. Great name for that piece of legislation, but it was the second federal stimulus package that really importantly pushed the CARES Act deadlines from December 2020 through December 31st of 2021. And between the CARES Act and the Consolidated Appropriations Act, the Ohio policymakers and legislature held back on some of the money. So about $2 billion, which they're now just finally pushing out the last of it. About 2 weeks ago, the Ohio House approved 4 different measures that push out the last of the CARES Act, Consolidated Appropriations Act federal monies in these 4 bills here. Which then leads us to today's conversation. And I think it's important to walk through that because CARES Act has a lot of relevance to the American Rescue Plan Act. The Consolidated Appropriations Act has equal weight, if you will. But as Renee said in the intro, we're looking at a $1.9 trillion relief package with a heavy emphasis on social equity. And there are a number of areas in this bill that you see a discernible change in administration in terms of the themes, the topics of consideration, even the general messaging. So there's a lot of social equity coming out of the Biden administration's federal stimulus package. A lot of money coming out to state and local governments. We're going to spend a lot of time, not a lot, but we'll spend some slides on State and local government funding here in a little bit. Includes a separate standalone $10 billion for critical infrastructure among states. I will address briefly at the end school district funding. We're getting a number of questions about how school districts can use their money. And for those of you on this call who are local economic development practitioners, if you've heard me say before, I think it's important to build good relationships with your schools. You may want to use some of the information I've got in school districts in here to share back with your schools as a, hey, I'm your friend, let's get along, here's some info to maybe help you, because school districts right now are scrambling with how to spend their $130 billion. You've got money going out to public transit. I've got some comments in here about the restaurants and bars funding, which just opened up applications, and then finally broadband access through schools and libraries. How can you use the money? Well, we don't know, right? So there's really only a couple elements of US Treasury guidance at this point, the most recent being on April 15th. There was a new landing page launched by US Treasury in which any piece of guidance from US Treasury as to how you can use the Rescue Plan Act money is going to land there, particularly on the state and local fiscal recovery fund dollars. It also put out, US Treasury did, some pre-steps that must be addressed from the county and the city level. Hold off on townships. I've got a comment on that later. But cities and counties, those of you on this call, you're just going to want to make sure you check in with your fiscal officer, your director of finance, ensure that your local community has DUNS and a SAM registration, which I'm sure everyone on this call, your communities already have these things. But in my career, I've run into some buzzsaws where if you don't get your DUNS number and your SAM registration lined up, you may have to wait a while to get assigned those numbers and registration keys to then get your federal money. There's a new, the day before that, there was a new Office of Recovery Programs established with a new direct report to the Undersecretary at Commerce, at Treasury, to then report out and monitor all federal spending across those three pieces of federal stimulus I just covered. What do we know that the state of Ohio is allowing us to do with the monies? Well, we don't know yet. For monies coming to the cities, or let's call them non-entitlement communities here in Ohio, the General Assembly is likely to appropriate those funds so that Ohio OBM can push the money out, including the funds to school districts, which is known as ESSER. But we don't have anything yet by the General Assembly to push those funds down into the local communities. If you're a county, or if you're a metro city, which includes on this call real quick, Parma, Cleveland, a couple other larger cities, you will get your monies directly from US Treasury. You do not have to worry about this step in the process. So what do we know that Ohio OBM is doing? Well, we know on the 19th, about a week and a half ago, about a week ago, 3 new funds are created at the state level to handle the incoming cash. We expect Ohio to receive about $5.5 billion, and it's going to go into the State Fiscal Recovery Fund, which has now been created by the Controlling Board. The non-entitlement communities, those are your non-metro cities, are going to be funded through the Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. And then finally, the Capital Projects Fund has its own bucket for cash as it comes in from the Treasury. What do we know what the Auditor of State is saying? And I pause here because this is really important. On the CARES Act, when we were handling a number of CARES Act eligibility questions, it really always came down to what are you going to tell your auditor? The Auditor of State will be sending folks out on premises in the next year or so, and you're going to want to make sure you can explain to him or her on site how you spent your federal stimulus funds. So it matters greatly what the Auditor of State is saying. At this point, Auditor Faber has only said really one thing that we can see, and that is make sure you're using separate fund accounts as the federal stimulus cash comes in. So not much else said so far. But let's get into it. And there's a lot in here. I'm going to cover this as quickly as I can so that we have maximum time for panel discussion and questions. But for those of you who are scrambling with broadband expansion, rural areas or broadband deserts in our more built environments. Know that there is money for school districts and libraries to address the homework gap, for the purchase of equipment and IT services through the American Rescue Plan Act. $7.17 billion is available for broadband expansion. And there are new rules that have been posted in the Federal Register as to how the FCC wants to get the money out. And each of these things in here should be hyperlinked as you see this document. This document will go out to you from Renee and her team. So don't feel if I'm speaking quickly, you have to take all these notes. You'll get a copy of this presentation at the end, to my knowledge. Restaurant Revitalization Fund. This one may go quick. You've got 28.6 billion available for restaurants, food trucks, brew pubs, tap rooms, and bars, including those within airport terminals, that they can receive up to $10 million per restaurant operator, equal to their revenue loss as a result of COVID. There's not a high bar to entry, just basically a good faith certification that you need the money and that you're not already receiving funding under the Shuttered Venue grant program. We understand that the feds want to push this out with a 7-day pilot for folks who would be invited to participate or submit a mock application to see how their systems work, because the SBA is loath to have their systems crash like we saw with the PPP programs about a year ago. There's another 21-day exclusion period for WBE and EDGE certified operators. So after all is said and done, we expect that these monies will go out quite quickly. And as an update, I've linked the SBA page with the application materials and other guidelines here. EDA has gotten another $3 billion in addition to the $1.5 billion they got under CARES Act. We understand that they're pushing the monies out using the same CARES Act application process, or what they call the NOFO. Love that acronym. Renee, going back to your comment that all things acronyms are awesome. I love EDA's NOFO. Sounds like a, I don't know, it sounds kind of cool. Anyway, so you use that NOFO to apply for up to $3 billion. It's sitting at EDA for economic development projects, particularly around strategy grants for planning or implementation grants, which could include construction. And those folks who can apply for these funds include the state, counties, cities, townships, special purpose units like CICs, institutions of higher ed, and so forth. What we don't know with EDA and their $3 billion, which are added onto the $1.5 billion that they got under CARES Act, is if they're following the same competitive and non-competitive process they did under CARES Act, which is if you had an existing EDA grant, you likely received a letter from EDA last year saying, hey, do you want more money? That would be the non-competitive allocation, in which case I would imagine most folks said yes. And that left a smaller pool for the competitive funding side. We don't know if EDA is going to do the same thing. We also don't know if the monies are going to be pushed out to the regional offices like they were in CARES Act, in which case the Chicago office under CARES Act had $225 million to push out across the Great Lakes states. Those monies went quick. We would expect probably $3 billion to go fairly quickly as well. There is new funding and a reinitiation, if you will, of the State Small Business Credit Initiative. Those of you on this call may be saying, that is an impressive acronym. What is it? It was a program that was launched in 2010 through 2017. It funded in Ohio, the Ohio Capital Access Program. These things are all at DSA. Small Business Collateral Enhancement Program, and then the Targeted Investment Program. These were mainly intended to help small business support and folks with connections with LMI communities. The Rescue Plan Act puts out another $10 billion, so it reinitiates the program that originally sunset back in 2017. These $10 billion are available through fiscal year 30 for small businesses to respond to COVID and the impact therefrom, with a $1.5 billion carve out for socially and economically disadvantaged individuals and another $500 million carve out for very small businesses or those that are less than 10 employees. State and local fiscal recovery funds. This will be kind of the balance of my comments today, and probably of most interest to folks on this call. Where CARES Act had said its purpose was to respond to the COVID-19 public health emergency period, what we see with the American Rescue Plan Act is this now a comma, right? Again, change in administration, change in majorities in the Congress, you see a different mindset, because now they're saying, well, we're also going to help offset revenue loss, we're going to bolster economic recovery, and we're going to provide premium pay for essential workers during the COVID pandemic. So first and foremost, the states are looking at receiving directly from Treasury a total of $219.8 billion available through December 31st of 2024. Each state will receive at least $500,000 or half a billion dollars. I have to remind myself, everything on here is an extra 3 zeros than anything I'm used to dealing with. So here you've got $500 million minimum at least to the states and DC. But really the way the formula works out, and it's a complicated formula, and as I've joked with others, I was no math major, but as you get through it, you're like, okay, basically it's at least your CARES Act allocation, which Ohio under CARES Act received $4.5 billion. But what we now know is under the American Rescue Plan Act, Ohio is going to receive another $5.5 billion. So even higher than what it received under the CARES Act. And this money is coming quickly. I've often remarked that this is going to be a strap on your jetpack kind of program, because those monies are going to come out within 60 days of a state submitting to the U.S. Treasury its, quote, certification of need. And the U.S. Treasury can either push the entirety of Ohio's $5.5 billion to the state, or it can push out $2.75 billion. There's some quick math, up to half of that for now, and then hold back on another 12 months for the remaining $2.75 billion if it requires that the state recertify its need. What can the state of Ohio use those monies on? A lot. So there's a covered period, just like there was a covered period under CARES Act. Recall, CARES Act covered period was March 1st, 2020 through December 2020, and then it was kind of pushed out, right? The Rescue Plan Act says something similar, and it says March 3, 2021 forward. Without much of there is an endpoint listed in the Rescue Plan Act, but not to that discernible date certain like what we saw in CARES Act. 4 things can be done with these monies. So CARES Act originally said responding to COVID-19. Okay, yeah, it says it right here in A. But now there's more stuff, right? Now you can use as a state the money to pay workers for essential work, a work premium pay, if you will. You can provide government services to the extent that governments had a reduction in revenue when you compare their most recent fiscal year. These are states rather right here. When you compare the state's most recent fiscal year prior to COVID's onset with its 2020 fiscal year during COVID, the state can use its monies to address government services resulting from that reduction in revenue. And finally, to make infrastructure investments. So this is getting a lot of attention in local economic development circles because it's got water, sewer, and broadband as a clearly eligible use of funds. There's some litigation out there. Our own Attorney General Yost has filed a lawsuit, or at least is joined in a lawsuit, seeking a comment that Congress's direction that you can't cut taxes in a state with the use of the Rescue Plan Act stimulus cash. A lot of this came out of either Kansas or Missouri. I should finally just figure out which state it is. I've been saying this for a couple of weeks, but either Kansas or Missouri their legislature was looking at cutting taxes for their state residents and using the Rescue Plan Act stimulus as an offsetting element. Well, Treasury came out pretty early on and said, you can't do that. And our Attorney General Yost says, no, I disagree. I think you shouldn't meddle in how the states would be using their federal stimulus. So look for that lawsuit to continue forward to some sort of resolution. We here at Bricker do not see the requirement or the prohibition against cutting taxes through use of federal stimulus cash here as impacting our ability to still offer TIF, CRA, and enterprise zones. Attorney General Yost in the last couple of weeks has been quoted in an article he posted on Yahoo News or some source like that, is saying he thinks that this prohibition on cutting taxes and offsetting those cuts with federal stimulus would impact TIF, enterprise zone, and CRA abatements. But quite frankly, speaking personally here, not for the firm, I saw that as more a political argument and not necessarily one that's tied back to how the enterprise zone, CRA, and TIF abatements actually work. So stay tuned on that. Who am I to disagree with the Attorney General, right? You may be saying, geez, Jeff, you got big boy pants on. But anyway, that's kind of what we're seeing here at Bricker. Now let's talk about the local government allocation. So you have another $130 billion that's going to go out to metro cities, counties, and both metro cities and counties will receive their funds directly from U.S. Treasury, and then non-entitlement communities, and those are non-metro cities. So metro cities will receive a total of $45.57 billion, and it's coming quickly, kind of like what we saw with the state cash. Non-entitlement units of local government, your non-metro cities, are going to go first to the state and then within 30 days out to the local governments. So again, this is the group that will be seeing appropriations probably by the Ohio General Assembly and then pushing out of cash and guidance from Ohio OBM. But each of the amounts are going to be capped at the most recent budget for those local governments of 75% of their budgets. I have here a link that you can use to go see what your estimated allocation would be for your local government. I do include on the next slide some representative samples. Forgive me or indulge me, if you will, that every community in Northeast Ohio, either I am from or I have family living in, I just said, well, what are they getting? So Berea, 3.6 billion, again, add 3 zeros to everything here. Brunswick, class of 93, go Blue Devils, 6.8 billion or 6.8 million. Refresh, I just said that billion comment, I'm sorry. Berea will be getting 3.6 million. Brunswick will be getting 6.8 million. City of Cleveland, however, will be getting $500 million or more. City of Parma, 24.2 million. Village of Spencer, mom and dad, that's where you live, you're looking at $154,000. And City of Strongsville looking at 8.7 million. Both Cleveland and Parma are metro cities. So metro cities under this analysis again, and under the statute, receive the funds directly from Treasury. They do not have to wait for Ohio OBM to push the money out. Funds are going out to the counties, total of 130 billion. Still on the same topic, 130 billion to metro cities, non-entitlement communities, and counties. Of that now, 65 billion going out to the counties. Again, these are going to be directly from Treasury to the counties. A representative sample of counties in the Team Neo region. Cuyahoga County is looking at 240 million. Lorain County, 60 million, and so forth. Harry, your own Tusk County. I always struggle to say Tuscarawas, so I will just say Tusk County, looking at 17.8 million coming under the federal stimulus, and it's coming quickly. What can the local governments use these funds for? It's the same list that we saw with the state. It's the original CARES Act purpose, which is to respond to COVID-19, including small business assistance, but then it's these other things now that are unique or new to the Rescue Plan Act. It's a worker premium pay for essential workers. It's to address reduction in revenue by local governments, and it's to make those same infrastructure investments in water, sewer, or broadband. There is yet actually I'll go back one. So even if it says here that you can do water, sewer, and broadband, note that there is an additional capital projects fund where each state will receive at least $100 million. In Ohio, we understand that to be $274 million for critical capital projects, most likely related to remote work and remote learning, which would be a lot of broadband expansion here is what we see. I'm gonna real quick touch on ESSER. We're getting a ton of questions at the firm on how K-12 funding works. For those of you on this call who have friends in your school districts, you may just want to share these slides once you get this PowerPoint deck after the presentation. There is a lot of money going out to our K through 12 partners. The monies will first come to the state, and then at least 90% of that's going to get pushed out statewide to local school districts. There's a broad use of the funding. So U.S. Department of Education has 5 questions that they ask school districts to ask themselves. Are you using the funds in a way that's reasonable and necessary in response to COVID? Does it promote equity? And does it support bringing kids back to the classroom? The statute itself has a number of things in here that school districts are taking a lot of interest in. The traditional things we saw even under CARES Act, clean and sanitizing facilities. Then you get into more things like technology purchases, addressing learning loss, school facility improvements and repairs. We're getting a lot of questions whether or not school facilities can actually be constructed using the ESSER funds, the ESSER funds are an element of the rescue plan, and then any other activities necessary to maintain the operations of school districts. For many of you on this call, you may say, schools are going to figure their own way out, but I just share this with you because there is a lot of chatter in the stimulus ecosystem as to what K through 12 districts can use with their money, can do with their money. I have 2 canned questions for just to share with you, and then Jennifer, Harry, and Bethany, I'm going to stop talking and let the panel start to kind of go through some questions or some thoughts. First, what about townships? Well, our analysis looks like townships will most likely be included as non-entitlement units of local government, but that's not clear and it's not definite. But when we think about the reading of the way the Rescue Plan Act was written, it seems to allow the HUD Secretary, which is Cleveland's own Marcia Fudge. Secretary Fudge may deem non-entitlement units of local government to include townships. So stay tuned on that. A lot of conversation among townships, as you would imagine, in the State House as to how townships are going to be included or not under the Rescue Plan Act. And then finally, school districts, we're getting a lot of questions from school districts. Can they use their ESSER funds, their federal stimulus funds, to pay existing teacher salaries under their existing employment contracts? We think so, but there's some nuance to that. But you may start hearing, even in your own communities, K through 12 educators saying, hey, maybe we'll start paying our teachers' salaries under existing contracts using our federal stimulus. Warning, you're using federal stimulus one-time cash to make recurring, ongoing salary commitments, but okay, it might be possible. So with that, I'm going to stop talking, and then Bethany, Jennifer, Harry, if we want to go through questions with Renee or just have some dialogue.
So we are going to have Jennifer here lead us through our Q&A on with our panelists, and push in with some suggestions and comments as well.
Thank you. So we have a question here asking whether there's been any discussion about discontinuing the unemployment extension after September 30th, or encouraging people to return to work and get off unemployment. Many of our businesses are now having to close due to not having workers rather than the pandemic itself.
We looked at unemployment and sick leave policies in the Rescue Plan Act for other clients, and I think the questioner's comment about September holds, that the Rescue Plan Act extended unemployment insurance payouts but did not increase payouts, but that extension takes us through September. So that's really the final statement of policy from the feds.
Excellent. We have another question here, and I encourage everyone to submit their questions in the Q&A. I'm surprised we don't have more questions, but so please go ahead and submit your question. Great opportunity to tap into Jeff's insight and knowledge on this, as well as Harry and Bethany to talk about their communities. Jeff, this is a question regarding the restaurant grants. Is it likely that an operator would need to subtract out what it received in PPP funds last year and calculating its revenue losses to prevent them from double dipping?
Great question. So we know that with clarity that you cannot participate in the Rescue Revitalization Fund if you're a shuttered operator. But to the point that you are not in the shuttered operator program, but you still receive PPP, what we saw under CARES Act is you did have to subtract those amounts out. I would imagine we have, recall from my earlier slide, we have virtually no Treasury guidance yet. I will bet you my own stimulus cash, haha, right, that you're going to have to remove PPP out of that equation for your restaurant revitalization fund. One final comment on that. There was a CNBC or some kind of conversation with the SBA director, and he or she said, more than likely, you're going to want to get your application in on day one because these things are going to be gone very, very quickly, which also could lead you to being one of those people who has to hit submit, enter on your keyboard for 4 hours to get your application in. So beware of that. But SBA is estimating that $28 billion is probably going to go out within a day or two.
Wow. Oh, that sounds like how my kids spend money. So that quickly. We have a question about the infrastructure, the funds used for infrastructure. Patrick's asking whether or not infrastructure to put in infrastructure projects such as new sewer and water lines, if that is an eligible expense, noting that there was an understanding that most of it was supposed to pay off bills of residence.
Right. Again, without, and thank you, Patrick, for the question. Without federal guidance beyond what we see in the statute, it looks to, there's a question we have within our own working group at Bricker, whether or not you need to tie every expenditure under Rescue Plan Act back to COVID-19, or can you just do flat out water and sewer enhancements in your community just because? What we don't have without further Treasury guidance is if you could just do sewer and water expansion just because, or as Patrick said, do you have to hold that money back and help your local residents who are impacted by COVID-19 with their utility bills? I actually think you're probably going to be able to do infrastructure just because, is my suspicion. But I don't want to bet anything more because I'm probably going to wind losing some money here as this stuff comes out.
All right, we have another question about utilizing the funds. Can ESSER funds be utilized for school construction projects? Noting that you mentioned it, but it wasn't clearly answered.
Oh, that is top of the mind question. We've actually got a flurry of activity in the last week on this. If you read ESSER in detail, it talks about HVAC improvements and building improvements to prevent the transmission of the virus. So filtration systems and so forth. There is a very active conversation right now among non-fund lawyers, right, Renee? The non-fund lawyers who don't listen to the OJs, who are thinking, well, maybe that allows you to build a new school facility, but maybe not. So that is a wonderful question. It is front and center for a lot of people right now. I don't have a clear answer as of right now, but sorry.
Okay, so we have a question about how the city of Cleveland has already announced it will be using the funds. But after this question, I would love to hear from Bethany and Harry on their thoughts on how the funds, what they've seen, not only in their communities, but surrounding communities, and thoughts on, again, other ways that the funds can be used at the local level. So this one was about the city of Cleveland's announcement that it will be using the funds for bringing in more film projects and creating events. Do you have any update on that?
I don't have any update on what the city of Cleveland will do. A lot of this is going to come down like what we saw in the CARES Act, that if you have a reasonable and thoughtful view from your law director, your outside external counsel, your village solicitor as to what you want to use the funds for, and you make the determination on the record through city council legislation, auditors, our understanding is they're going to generally respect that. So as the city of Cleveland is making its own decisions on that $500 million plus allocation it's going to get, we'll have to rely on their very capable in-house attorneys and external counsel to say that's the right use.
Awesome. So Jeff, just to clarify then, at the local level, expenditure of these dollars will still have to go through their city council or council of trustees as any other funding decision, budget decision would be made?
So in CARES Act, it definitely was the case. There was actual, I call it magic language that you would want to include in every one of your city council legislation pieces, either resolution or ordinance. Without the U.S. Treasury guidance on the Rescue Plan Act, we can't say, but man, I would imagine they'll probably take the CARES Act guidance and put a new date on it and say things like, hey, you have to put in a city council piece of legislation why you're using the funds this way, because the auditor is going to be looking at that in a couple of years.
Okay. So then, Bethany, would you like to share kind of what you've seen from various, city councils in your county and townships about how they plan to use the dollars? I know during the CARES Act, lots of innovative programs and grant programs and economic relief programs were set up. What are you hearing?
So without knowing exactly what regulations for the new recovery funds will be, the Medina County Commissioners are gathering input right now and planning for potential priorities, but they're not making decisions yet. So once the regulations are released, they plan to meet in a public session to discuss how they want to spend the funds. One theme of their decisions, just based on my conversations with local officials, is to basically dream big, to invest in projects that will have a substantial impact on the local economy. Some of the potential projects they're thinking about include actual physical public facilities that would otherwise not likely be constructed, kind of using one-time money on one-time projects. And as Jeffrey mentioned, expansion of a community's broadband capabilities is definitely, we believe, within the rescue plan opportunity. So in Medina County, our Port Authority operates a publicly owned fiber network. So, I'm pushing because I think it makes sense to use a portion of the rescue plan dollars to help expand the backbone. It's a 150-mile commercial network we've already built. It does include connection to schools and libraries, so that nexus is already there. We could also potentially partner with the fiber to the home provider, which is now building out a new network in Medina County to reach even further into our rural residential communities, which have lacked access to any significant broadband capabilities. I think we've all seen that broadband has become crucial for remote work and remote learning over the past year. Those needs are not going away, and we've got communities that we need to reach. So I would say, even if your community doesn't have a locally owned fiber network, there are still opportunities. If you look at the state budget, the governor is calling for a $250 million investment in residential broadband. So private sector telecommunications firms will be obtaining grants to build out new residential networks throughout the state. So one thought is that a local community can use some of the rescue plan funding that they'll receive to leverage those new private sector telecom investments by inducing those telecommunications firms to stretch into areas where they otherwise might not build, where there might not be enough of a return on investment for them. They could also help by funding extra equipment that will make a new residential network more robust to get even more and better broadband. Another possibility that a local community would have for using rescue plan dollars is creating a new small business relief grant fund. I know that many communities, including Medina County, did set up grant funds with last year's CARES dollars. So if there are still needs for business support, I would think that the rescue plan could help fund such a program. In Medina County in 2020, our Economic Development Office worked hand in hand with the commissioners to coordinate grant relief, which totaled about $4 million. We funded nearly 400 businesses with grants up to $10,000, in some cases a little bit larger, because we did focus the biggest grants on the hardest hit areas like restaurants, hospitality, daycare, although there were a number of other industries who needed help because of their impacts of the stay-at-home orders. Based on the business recovery and the demand for workforce that we're seeing in the local economy right now, I don't think we'll plan on another grant relief program here in Medina County, but every community is different. So if you still have struggling businesses in your community, a grant program is a definite option. So I'd be happy to share in more detail about how we organize Medina County's program if you want to contact me offline.
Great. Harry, do you want to share some of what you're seeing?
Honestly, Bethany really covered a wealth of information there, but what we're looking at now from a Tuscarawas County perspective, or perhaps a regional perspective, is what projects can we create, with monies from the ARP that will have a long-lasting benefit for the region. And so looking at it more regionally than just Tuscarawas County. I would agree with Bethany about the small business grant programs. We had 2 small business grant programs that we ran in Tuscarawas County. Do we still have some struggling businesses? Sure. I mean, it's inevitable that we have struggling businesses all the time, regardless of the pandemic. Whether or not they were actually struggling because of the pandemic is an interesting question. Going back to the question that in fact was the first question we had, and that was, will the continued unemployment benefits create opportunities for people to stay at home rather than go back to work? Anecdotally, we've heard from some businesses that have said they're having difficulty getting people that they normally had to work back to work because of that. But from a actual working standpoint, I think that's probably few and far between that people aren't going back to work for that reason. I'm sure there are many people not going back to work because it's still difficult if you have a 2 working spouse family, one covering childcare while the other one works is probably more common than what we think it might be. So I think that issue is going to continue. It'd be interesting to see how we might be able to utilize some of the ARP funding to be able to support getting both spouses back to work if indeed that's exactly what they want to do. So I think there's, of course, it really depends on the flexibility of the ARP funds and the guidance that comes out, but I do believe there's some real opportunities. And now we are down to just 2 minutes.
Yeah. Well, and Renee,
back to you.
We do have a few questions that came in, and it looks like that the panelists all are able to stay for another 5 minutes or so. So I just want to make sure that the audience, I know some of you might have to hop off, but if you are able to stay, we'll continue on with a couple more questions for a couple more minutes here. So I'm going to, Jeff, I see you wanted to answer the question about using it for revenue replacement to cover the decline in revenue based on variances compared to the 2019 baseline. Do you mind giving a quick answer to that? Oh, you're muted, sorry.
Sure am, sorry about that. A year in, you'd think I'd figure that out by now. The questioner had asked, hey, Jeff, did you say that local governments can use their Rescue Plan Act dollars to cover themselves for revenue they lost in 2019? The answer is yes. Yes, you can. What I don't know is if the local government using the money to support government services in relation to what they lost from 2019, if that use of funds has to be COVID related. I don't think it will be, but just stay tuned on that without guidance, we're going to have to figure that out. But yes, I did say that you can use your local government funds for things that you may have lost revenue or for amounts that you may have lost revenue from 2019.
Okay, great. And again, so if you have to jump off, I know even a couple of our panelists might need to. We'd love for you to stay for a few more minutes. But I also wanted to share that Renee mentioned that she will be copying all the questions and sharing them with Jeff for a Q&A that will be sent with these slides later on. Okay, I want to combine these two. It's basically about whether or not these dollars can be used for any planning, such as studies, local economic development strategies and planning. Let's see, we have another one who asked about, can you use it for, oh, sorry, it looks like that one was answered. Yeah, so there were a couple questions about using it for planning, which sometimes is an excluded purpose. Can you talk about that? Oh, and then can you use it to do to fund a redevelopment planning and zoning review study.
Okay, so we know that EDA and their $3 billion that Commerce got is expressly allowed for planning. But if you want to use your local government fiscal recovery fund dollars, I don't know. CARES Act was a little squeamish about using funding for long-term planning unless it related back to COVID-19. So I would recommend, back to Jamie who asked the question, that so long as you can show that the planning is directly related to COVID-19, you're probably going to be okay. But if you're just doing a general comp plan or a comp plan update for a community, you know, absent any connection point back to the COVID-19 response, without further guidance, I wouldn't necessarily go there yet.
Okay.
Looks like, do we have any more questions that are lingering out there, Jennifer?
I think we have two that haven't been answered. EDA has financially supported creating regional CEDs.
Right.
On one of your previous slides, you indicated EDA could fund county CEDs. Do you see them changing their current regional stance?
Good question. Right. So yeah, so CEDs are typically going to be on the regional level. You know, I guess what I would look at is, we did hear feedback that, well, EDA is EDA, right? Sometimes you got to kind of read between the lines with them, that they want to see regional CEDs. There was some allowance under CARES Act to do county or kind of localized planning. But then the feedback we got out of Chicago last year was, no, we want to see it regional. So that is about as a non-answer as I can give. Let's just figure that you may be able to pursue planning dollars for your localized community through EDA, but maybe it's not under the moniker of CEDs. Maybe it's just county economic development project planning, and leave it at that.
Okay. Renee, I'd like to get to this one last question if we can. There's a few other ones, but this one hasn't been touched on at all. And it's a question about whether or not cities and counties can utilize the funds to develop strategic workforce initiatives. So I guess that's almost more program development than studying or planning. So can you answer that one, Jeff?
Yeah, let's try and answer in this way. One, you remember in the four-part uses of funds, local governments can use their local fiscal recovery fund to support government services that maybe were impacted from COVID-19 revenue drop, right? So arguably, a workforce strategy is a government service. So, you know, let's check that and say, yeah, okay, sounds good. And then moreover, if you make the workforce strategy a COVID-19 response by the local government, you're probably looking really good now, right? In terms of probably another check mark, you might be in the good. But I will say that there were some workforce dollars in the Rescue Plan Act. I didn't get into them today because they're somewhat limited. It's airline jobs, manufacturing, certain manufacturing, and aviation manufacturing, workforce dollars. But what we're seeing with the President Biden new American jobs plan that's now currently being negotiated in Congress, that is going to be a huge workforce type program or policy set. I would imagine we'll see more workforce dollars coming out of the Biden American jobs plan, which is still in its draftsmanship right now. Before we, so we may want to hold off on workforce stuff until we see what the next administration outlay is.
Okay. Renee, do we have time for one more question or should we wrap up?
We should wrap up. We're at 10:06. We have gone over, and I appreciate all of our guests who have attended today. Thank you to Jennifer, Jeff, Harry, Bethany, who had to leave. We will follow up with a post Q&A. I have been cataloging these questions as they have been coming in. Please email me if you've got additional questions that you would like included with the Q&A, and we will get those over to Jeff with a concise answer for everyone to reference for their future, along with his presentation. And lastly, if you have great economic development music you would like to share with us, you just might hear it at the beginning of a node meeting one morning. So do share that with us. We'd love to hear from you. Everyone, please have a great day and week to come. Take care.
And Thank you all.